in the American Society by Gish Jen, written in 1986. When my father took over the pancake house, it was to send my little sister Mona and me to college. We were only in junior high at the time, but my father believed in getting a jump on things. Those Americans always saying it, he told us, smart guys thinking in advance. My mother elaborated, explaining that business took bringing up, like children. They could take years to get going, she said, years. In this case, though, we got rich right away. At 2 months, we were breaking even. And at 4, those same hot cakes that could barely withstand the weight of butter and syrup were supporting our family with ease. My mother bought a station wagon with air conditioning. My father an oversized red vinyl recliner for the back room. And as time went on and the business continued to thrive, my father started to talk about his grandfather and the village he had reigned over in China, things my father had never talked about when he worked for other people. He told us about the bags of rice his family would give out the poor at New Year's, and about the people who came to beg on their hands and knees for his grandfather to intercede for more wayward of their relatives. Like that Godfather in the movie, he would tell us. As his feet up, he distributed paychecks. Sometimes an employee would get 2 green envelopes instead of 1, which meant that Jimmy needed a tooth pulled, say, or that Tiffany's husband was in the clinker again. It's nothing, he would insist, sinking back into his chair. Who else is going to take care of you people? My mother would mostly just sigh about it. Your father thinks this is China, she would say, and then she would go back to her mending. Once in a while, though, when my father had given away a particularly large sum, she would exclaim, outraged, but this here is the U.S. of A., this apparently having been what she used to tell immigrant stock boys when they came in late. She didn't work at the supermarket anymore, but she had made it to the rank of manager before she left, and this had given her not only new words and phrases, but new ideas about herself and about America, and about what was what in general. She had opinions now on how downtown should be zoned. She could pump her own gas and check her own oil, and for all she used to chide Mona and me for being copycats, she herself was now interested in espadrilles and wallpaper, and most recently the 2 country clubs. So join already, said Mona, flicking a fly off her knee. My mother enumerated the problems as she sliced up a quarter round of watermelon. There was the cost, there was the waiting list, there was the fact that no one in our family played either tennis or golf. So what? Said Mona. It would be a waste, said my mother. Me and Callie can swim in the pool. Plus you need that recommendation letter from a member. Come on, said Mona. Annie's mom would write you a letter in a sack. My mother's knife glinted in the early summer sun. I spread some more newspaper on the picnic table. Plus, you don't have to eat there. You have to eat there twice a month. You know what that means? My mother cut another enormous slice of fruit. No, I don't know what that means, said Mona. It means Daddy would have to wear a jacket, dummy, I said. Oh, said Mona, clasping her hand to her breast. Oh. We all laughed. My father had no use for nice clothes and would wear only 10-year-old shirts with grease-spotted pants to show how little he cared what anyone thought. Your father doesn't believe in joining the American Society, said my mother. He wants to have his own society. So go to dinner without him. Mona shot her seeds out in long arcs over the lawn. Who cares what he thinks? But of course we all did care, and knew my mother could not simply up and do as she pleased, for in my father's mind a family owed its head a degree of loyalty that left no room for dissent. To embrace what he embraced was to love, and to embrace someone else was to betray him. He demanded a similar sort of loyalty of his workers, whom he treated more like servants than employees. Not in the beginning, of course. In the beginning, all he wanted was for them to keep on doing what they used to do, and to that end, he concentrated mostly on leaving them alone. As the months passed, though, he expected more and more of them, with the result that for all this largesse, he began to have trouble keeping help. The cooks and the busboys complained that he asked them to fix radiators and trim hedges, not only at the restaurant but at our house. The waitresses that he sent them on errands and made them chauffeur him around. Our head waitress, Gertrude, claimed that he once even asked her to scratch his back. It's not just the blacks that don't believe in slavery, she said when she quit. My father never quite registered for complaint, though not those of the others who left. Even after Eleanor quit, then Tiffany, then Gerald, then Jimmy, and even his best cook, Eureka Andy, for whom he had bought new glasses, he remained mostly convinced that the fault lay with them. All they understand is that assembly line, he lamented. Robots they are. They want to be robots. There were occasions when the clear running truth seemed to Eddie, when he would pinch the vinyl of his chair up into little peaks and wonder if he were doing things right. But with time, he would always smooth the peaks back down, and when business started to slide in the spring, he kept on like a horse in his ways. By the summer, our dish boy was overwhelmed with scrapings. It was no longer just the hash browns that people were leaving for trash, and the service was just as bad as the food. The waitresses served up French pancakes instead of German, apple juice instead of orange, spilt things on laps, on coats. On the 4th of July, some greenhorn sent an entire side of fries salaming down a lady's Massif Central. Meanwhile, in the back room, my father labored through articles on the economy. What is housing starts, he puzzled. What is GMP? Mona and I did what we could, filling in as bus girls and bookkeepers, and one afternoon, stuffing the comments box that hung by the cashier's desk. That was Mona's idea. We rustled up a variety of pens and pencils, checked boxes for an hour, smeared the cards up with coffee and grease, and waited. It took a few days for my father to notice that the box was full, and he didn't say anything about it for a few more days. Finally, though, he started to complain of fatigue. And then he began to complain that the staff was not what it could be. We encouraged him in this, pointing out, for instance, how many dishes got shipped. But in the end, all that happened was that for the first time since we took over the restaurant, my father got into his head to fire someone. Skip, a skinny busboy who was saving up for a sports car, and said nothing as my father mumbled on about the price of dishes. My father's hands shook as he wrote out the severance check, and he spent the rest of the day napping in his chair once it was over. As it was going on midsummer, Skip wasn't easy to replace. We hung a sign in the window and advertised in the paper, but no one called the first week, and the person who called the second didn't show up for his interview. The third week, my father phoned Skip to see if he would come back, but a friend of his already sold him a Corvette for cheap. Finally, a Chinese guy named Booker turned up. He couldn't have been more than 30, but he looked as though life had him pinned. His eyes were bloodshot and his chest sunken, and the muscles of his neck seemed to strain with the effort of holding his head up. In a single dry breath, he told us that he had never bussed tables but was willing to learn, and that he was on the lam from the deportation authorities. I do not want to lie to you, he kept saying. He had come to the United States on a student visa, had run out of money, and was now in a bind. He was loath to go back to Taiwan, as it happened. He looked up at this point to be sure my father wasn't pro-KMT, but all he had was a phony Social Security card and a willingness to absorb all blame, should anything untoward come to pass. I do not think anyway that it is against law to hire me, only to be me, he said, smiling faintly. Anyone else would have examined him on this, but my father conceived of laws as speed bumps rather than curbs. He wiped the counter with his sleeve and told Booker to report the next morning. I will be good worker, said Booker. Good, said my father. Anything you want me to do, I will do. My father nodded. Booker seemed to sink into himself for a moment. Thank you, he said finally. I appreciate your help. I am very, very appreciate for everything. He reached out to shake my father's hand. My father looked at him. Did you eat today? He asked in Mandarin. Booker pulled at the hem of his jacket. Sit down, said my father. Please, have a seat. My father didn't tell my mother about Booker, and my mother didn't tell my father about the country club. She would never have applied except that Mona, while over at Annie's, had let it drop that our mother wanted to join. Mrs. Lardner came by the very next day. Why, I'd be honored and delighted to write you people a letter, she said. Her skirt billowed around her. Thank you so much, said my mother, but it's too much trouble for you, and also my husband is... Oh, it's no trouble at all, I tell you. She leaned forward so that her chest freckles showed. I know just how it is. It's a secret, of course, but you know my natural father was Jewish. Can you see it? Just look at my skin. My husband, said my mother. I'd be delighted, honored and delighted, said Mrs. Lardner with a little wave of her hands, just honored and delighted. Mona was triumphant. See, Mom, she said, waltzing around the kitchen when Mrs. Lardner left. What did I tell you? I'd just honored and delighted, just honored and delighted. She waved her hands in the air. You know, the Chinese have a saying, said my mother, to do nothing is better than to overdo. You mean well, but you tell me now what will happen. I'll talk Dad into it, said Mona, still waltzing. Or I bet Callie can. He'll do anything Callie says. I can try anyway, I said. Did you hear what I said, said my mother. Mona bumped into the broom closet door. You're not going to talk anything. You've already made enough trouble. She started on the dishes with a clatter. Mona poked diffidently at a mop. I sponged off the counter. Anyway, I ventured, I bet our name will never come up. That's if we're lucky, said my mother. There's all these people waiting, I said. Good, she said. She started on a pot. I looked over at Mona, who was still cowering in the broom closet. In fact, their son Black family's been waiting so long, they're going to sue, I said. My mother turned off the water. Where'd you hear that? Patty told me. She turned the water back on, started to wash a dish. She then put it back and shut the faucet. I'm sorry, said Mona. Forget it, said my mother. Just forget it. Booker turned out to be a model worker whose boundless gratitude translated into a willingness to do anything. And he also learned quickly. He soon knew not only how to bus, but how to cook and how to wait tables and how to keep the books. He fixed the walk-in door so that it stayed shut, reupholstered the torn seats in the dining room, and devised a system for tracking inventory. The only stone in the rice was that he tended to be sickly, but reliable even in illness. He would always send a friend to take his place. In this way, we got to know Ronald, Lynn, Dirk, and Cedric, all of whom, like Booker, had problems with their legal status and were anxious to please. They weren't as capable as Booker, though, with the exception of Cedric, whom my father often hired even when Booker was well. A round wag of a man who called Mona and me shuhao, skinny monkeys. He was a professed non-smoker who was nevertheless always begging drags off other people's cigarettes. The last habit drove our head cook Fernando crazy, especially since, when refused a hit, Cedric would occasionally snitch one. Winking impishly at Mona and me, he would sneak up to the ashtray, take a quick puff, and then break out laughing as the smoke came rolling out of his mouth in a great incriminatory cloud. Fernando accused him of stealing cigarettes, too, even whole packs. "Why do you think he's weaseling around in the back of the store all the time?" he said. His face was blotchy with anger. "That man is a thief." Other members of the staff supported him in this contention and joined in on an operation identification, which involved numbering and initialing their cigarettes, even though what they seemed to fear for wasn't so much their cigarettes as their jobs. Then one of the cooks quit, and rather than promote someone, my father hired Cedric for the position. Rumors flew that he was taking only the normal salary, that Alex had been pressured to resign, and that my father was looking for a position with which to placate Booker, who had been bypassed because of his health. The result was that Fernando categorically refused to work with Cedric. "The only way I'll cook with that piece of slime," he said, shaking his huge tattooed fist, "is if he's frying on the grill." My father cajoled and cajoled to no avail, and in the end was simply forced to put them on different schedules. The next day, Fernando got caught stealing a carton of minute steaks. My father would not even tell Mona and me how he knew to be standing by the back door when Fernando was on his way out, but everyone suspected Booker. Everyone but Fernando, that is, who was sure Cedric had been the tip-off. My father held a staff meeting in which he tried to reassure everyone, was so amazed that he was being allowed to stay, that Fernando was incensed nonetheless. "Don't you all be putting your bug eyes on me," he said. "He's the crook." He grabbed Cedric by the collar. Cedric raised an eyebrow. "Cook, you mean?" he said. At this, Fernando punched Cedric in the mouth, and the words he had just uttered, notwithstanding, my father fired him on the spot. With everything that was happening, Mona and I were ready to be getting out the restaurant. It was almost time. The days were still stuffy with summer, but our window shade had started flapping in the evenings as if gearing up to go out. That year the breezes were full of salt, as they sometimes were when they came in from the east, and they blew anchors and docks through my mind like so many tumbleweeds, filling my dreams with wherries and lobsters and grainy-faced men who squinted day in and day out at the sky. It was time for a change. You could feel it, and yet the pancake house was the same as ever. The day before school started, my father came home with bad news. "Fernando called police," he said, wiping his hand on his pant leg. My mother naturally wanted to know what police, and so with much coughing and hawing, the long story began, the latest installment of immigration sending an investigator. My mother sat still as a whalebone as my father described how the man summarily refused lunch on the house, and how my father had admitted under pressure that he knew there were things about his workers. So now what happens? My father didn't know. Booker and Cedric went with him to the jail, he said, but me, here I am. He laughed uncomfortably. The next day my father posted bail for his boys and waited apprehensively for something to happen. The day after that he waited again, and the day after that he called our neighbor's law student's son, who suggested my father call the immigration department under an alias. My father took his advice, and it was thus that he discovered that Booker was right. It was illegal for aliens to work, but it wasn't to hire them. Okay? Keep watching. I'm going to move on to the next video for the next part.